Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Matt Williams. I'm the lead therapist at the Training Shed and I'm here to deliver the VMove 2 running series. These are going to be 4 different webinars we're going to be releasing over the coming months, detailing different topics surrounding VMove 2 and running. The first of these webinars is going to be connecting gait analysis to VMove 2 assessments. So strap in because this is going to be a lot of fun. So before we get stuck in, I just want to give you a little bit more information about who we are. So as I said, my name is Matt Williams. I work at the Training Shed. I'm the lead therapist there. And the Training Shed is a health and wellbeing company based in the UK. And our mission is to change the way we think of wellbeing, not just in the UK, but around the world. And we work with a lot of large companies in Europe, North America, Australasia, all over the place. And our philosophy is driven around education. This idea, if we can educate you on the factors around your health and well-being, you have the control then in your life to make a positive change. And that's where dorsaVi comes in, because dorsaVi gives our patients and clients insight and education into their own movement patterns. We can do an assessment with them with dorsaVi and the VMove 2 analysis and really delve into them, deep into their movement patterns, and make that positive change. So let's get stuck in and let's talk about the running series. So as mentioned, we're going to do 4 different webinars over the coming months. The first one of these webinars is going to be this one here, which is the gait analysis and VMove 2 webinar. In this one, we're going to be talking about how we can connect the gait analysis to your VMove 2 assessment, because too often we do one or the other. We don't look at them both as together, and actually looking at one can be misleading. Combining the two will make you a much better clinician. In the second webinar coming up, we're going to look at a running assessment in general. So we're going to be looking at more detail into gait. So we're going to be talking about a few different gait analysis aspects today, but we're really going to delve deeper into that gait analysis in the second webinar. We're also going to look at then at how you can use the lower back, run and knee modules in a running assessment. The third one coming up next year will be the return to running webinar, where we can look at how you can use VMove 2 to determine when it's the right time to get an injured athlete back running. And the final one, the fourth one, is probably the most exciting one, probably one that we haven't, no one's really had much experience in. It's going to be VMove 2 in performance, so how we can use VMove 2 to analyse different tests, things like 5 metre, 10 metre sprints, T-tests, Cooper runs, and also use it in relation to things like heart rate monitor testing. So when we're looking at developing a running program and telling people to run at different zones, we can use this heart rate monitor in conjunction with VMove 2 to produce this much better, more rounded running program. So that's a very exciting webinar coming up next year. So without further ado, we will talk about what we're going to discuss today. So we've got 5 key points we're going to look at. So the first one is going to be understanding the metrics. This is something that we just need to drill in. We're all familiar with asymmetry index, ground reaction force, initial peak acceleration, ground contact time, cadence, but sometimes we don't really understand what they mean. So that's going to be the first part of this webinar today. We're then going to talk about the normative data. So when you're looking at the results, you've got your athlete or your patient's results sat in front of you. Where do they fit compared to the norms? We then need to look at the influencing factors. So what factors are going to determine what the metrics are going to produce. We're then going to look at gait and VMove 2, where we've got 2 little videos that we're going to show you and look at what things we might expect to see. And then we're very briefly going to talk about gait retraining, when to do it, how to do it, and in the example we're going to give the things that we would look to change with this individual and that we have. This is only a very brief part of this particular webinar. As I said, we're going to cover the gait retraining and the gait analysis in more detail in the second webinar. Today's one is very much more focusing on the gait and VMove 2. So without further ado, we're going to move on to the first metric, which is asymmetry index. So this is the one that is underused. This links directly to that ground reaction force, and demonstrates that loading pattern. Does an individual load their left-hand side or their right-hand side a little bit more? And for that reason, I think it's very, very important. But I say it's one that we just kind of go, oh, your asymmetry is this, and we just kind of gloss over it and we look at the bigger, meatier, nicer numbers. But actually, if we spend some time here, we can really understand that loading pattern. Does someone load their left-hand side a little bit more? Do they load their right-hand side a little bit more? And if so, why is that? Have they got any muscle imbalances, any asymmetries, anything that we need to be aware of? And what effect is that going to have? The way that the vMove2 and the vMove assessments have produced is they've got this nice traffic light system. So green with kind of anything up to 0 to 5% is okay. That's a normal range of asymmetry. Anything over that goes into the amber and then eventually the red. So that's a nice handy little tip, little tool there that you can just take that snapshot assessment and see how an individual is performing. So ground reaction force, we talked there about asymmetry being linked to ground reaction force. So ground reaction force in vMove and vMove2 assessments relates to the average vertical force applied to the ground during mid-stance. So it's not at initial contact, it is at the mid-stance. Okay, so that's something we really have to bear in mind when we are doing the assessments. Now, there is no direct relationship between ground reaction force and injuries. So why do we look at it? Well, it gives us a deeper insight into how the athlete is moving. What forces are their joints, muscles, tendons, ligaments undergoing? And is this something that we need to take note of? And although there's going to be no increased risk to injury, it is still an important factor to look at. Now, we know from the research that higher ground reaction force values are expected as speed increases. We also know the larger the vertical displacement or vertical oscillation, we will see larger ground reaction forces as well. But also body mass is something that we need to take into consideration. The higher someone's body mass is, the higher the ground reaction force is going to be. So when we're doing an assessment and we're getting the athlete to fill in their details at the very start, take a note of that body mass, because that is really going to play a factor. If we come back with someone that's got a ground reaction force of over 2,000 or even over 3,000, it might not be that we look at actual gait changes. It might be actually look at physical changes and we go on to a weight loss intervention before we start looking too much deeper into the running. But we'll come on to that very much in the later slides. So the next one along on the assessment is the initial peak acceleration, and this is the vertical acceleration and loading rate through the tibia at initial contact. And this is very much linked to control. How well you can control this loading rate will determine how high or low your initial peak acceleration is. And the higher these values, it can indicate kind of a predisposition to loading stress injuries. So we're looking at your medial tibial stress syndromes and your stress fractures. So here there is a direct relationship between initial peak acceleration and injuries. We know that with speed increases, we can see an increase of initial peak acceleration between 1 to 2 Gs. So again, if we're doing an assessment with someone and they're at the top end of this initial peak acceleration, we might not want to increase the speed too much more and tip that initial peak acceleration over the edge. We also know that harder surfaces will also increase initial peak acceleration, and we'll discuss a few other factors that will in a few slides' time. Weight, however, may or may not affect initial peak acceleration. We're unsure on this at the moment, and which is quite interesting when we're talking about is this loading rate. Weight itself has no influence over it. And when we're looking at these values, we've got these two kind of figures that we need to keep in our mind. If the value is over 10 Gs, they're a stomper. These are the runners that we can hear before we see them. The heavy ones, they're almost the elephant type runners. And this is a red flag. Anything over 10 Gs we can really associate to these loading stress injuries. Anything less than 4 Gs, this is going to be quite a cautious runner. It's almost like they're running on eggshells. And this is quite an indicative figure response of someone who is just coming back from injury. Typically these loading stress injuries, the ones that have been out with things like stress fractures for quite a while, the first time running back, they're a little bit tentative. So that's something just to bear in mind when you are doing these assessments and you see these numbers. What might the athlete be going through? So look at it from a psychological point as well as a mechanical point. Ground contact time, well, this is quite simply the amount of time you spend on the floor. And again, there is no direct correlation between an injury here, but we are talking about force exposure here. So if you've got a nice kind of ground reaction force with a normative value of, let's say, 1500, but the ground contact time is low, it's over 300 milliseconds, they're going to have a larger force exposure. What's that going to then do to their joints, their muscles, their tendons and ligaments? It's going to put them under more stress. So is that going to affect their movement patterns? Is that going to affect their injury risk? We're unsure, but it's something to bear in mind and keep into the forefront of your mind when you are doing these assessments. Now, naturally, as we increase our speed, ground contact time will decrease. It's also heavily influenced by cadence as well. We also know hamstring activation will affect ground contact time. And we know from the research that anything less than 260 milliseconds needs an improvement. But we're unlikely to see a figure less than 180 milliseconds, even in someone who is sprinting. That's an unusual number to see. Now finally, we're looking at cadence. Now cadence is this kind of poster boy of running. In recent years, last 10 years in particular, cadence has been at the forefront of people's minds, going, you need to have this cadence, you need to be doing this. Don't worry about anything else, it's all about cadence. And the truth is, though there is no single ideal number, it's more of a range of 165 to 185. We know that if you've got less than 165, we need to improve that. But equally, if we're about 185, we're not going to see a benefit if we improve it. We do know as well from the data that we can reduce patellofemoral loading by about 15 to 20% by changing cadence. And we know that changes in cadence will influence ground contact time, initial peak acceleration, and ground reaction force. Now the easiest way to change cadence is run faster, but that's the easy way. You can actually change cadence without affecting speed. And we will again look at this in the second webinar. So I'm giving you a few teasers as we go along the way for what's coming up. Now the pinnacle, the golden ticket for cadence is this long stride length and this high rate of cadence. This is difficult to attain though. So although many runners might strive to get it, we've got to bring them down to that perspective of going, it is difficult. Mo Farah famously has a cadence of about 195 and a stride length of about 2 meters. And if you can attain that, fantastic, that's brilliant. That is as good as your cadence is ever going to get, and your stride length is ever going to get. You're going to be a fantastically economical runner. However, it is very hard to achieve that. So we shouldn't be pushing everyone to do that unless they show that kind of inclination that they might be able to change their style, change their cadence, and devote the time to do that. It will take a long time to achieve that goal. So the normative data then. So they've got the 4 parameters we've just discussed. We've got ground reaction force. For males, normative data here runs between about 1500 to 2000 newtons. For females, it's slightly less, of 800 to 1800 newtons. And we can expect a bilateral difference of about 100 newtons. Initial peak acceleration, here we've got a normative value between 5 and 8 Gs. Foot striking things and surfaces will influence these, and we'll talk about that in the slides coming up. And with this, we're also looking at a bilateral difference between 1 to 2 Gs. Ground contact time as well. Anything less than 260 is the norm. We don't want anything over 260 milliseconds, and we can attribute a 20 millisecond bilateral difference. And do bear in mind that when we are looking at ground contact time, we are dealing with milliseconds here. We're not dealing with seconds. Milliseconds, naturally these are shorter than seconds. So the time frame for this is massively small. So just bear that in mind when we are talking about numbers. You know, there is not a massive difference between 255 and 260. Okay, we are dealing with milliseconds. And cadence, we've already talked about the normative range there being 165 to 185. So we're now going to look at some of the factors that might influence these. So ground reaction force, will come back around to the start. The big factor here is going to be mass. The higher someone's body mass is, the likelihood is their ground reaction force is going to be higher. So it might well be that when we are looking at someone running, and we might want to start making some changes. If their ground reaction force is high, say over 3,000 newtons, but their body mass itself is quite high, we might want to actually look at reducing some body mass before we delve too much deeper into the actual running changes. Gender as well will have an influence. We saw there on the previous slide the slight differences between ground reaction force between males and females. So again, another factor just to bear in mind. Speed as well. We talked about the research showing how speed will affect ground reaction force and increase it as speed increases. Structural asymmetries as well will influence them. Things like leg length discrepancies will affect the loading pattern. So you are going to expect to see some asymmetrical differences, symmetrical differences, between limbs if there is a structural asymmetry. And finally, the loading rate. This is more talking about those that are trying to protect a joint or protect a particular injury. They might physically unload an area. So you might get a relatively normal number on one leg, but on the other leg that they're trying to protect, the figure could be much, much lower. So it's always important when you are looking at assessments to delve into the whole details of why they're running. Have they had any injuries? What might be affecting them? And it's a similar story here for initial peak acceleration. Again, the loading patterns will affect it. If they're trying to protect a particular limb, a particular structure or injury site, will affect their initial peak acceleration. Their foot striking as well, so heel striking, will naturally increase IPA. You're going to see higher IPA figures with heel strikers. You are typically going to see smaller numbers, around about the 5 Gs with forefoot strikers. Speed as well, we saw about a 1 to 2 G increase with speed. Shoes as well will have a massive impact. If you've got a less cushioned shoe, that will naturally increase your IPA. And finally, surface. IPA is going to be high if you run on the road compared if you run on a field. And even if you run on a track, it's going to be massively different between the three surfaces. And if you combine these factors together, if you run at quite a high speed on the road, you're a heel striker and you're running in a very minimalist shoe, we can expect your IPA to be quite high. Now, ground contact time, there are fewer instances here, fewer factors that influence ground contact time. The big two are obviously cadence and speed. The faster you run, the more steps you do, naturally your ground contact time is going to be lower. Stride length as well is going to affect ground contact time. Stride length with a high cadence will see a smaller ground contact time, but stride length in the absence of a high cadence will see a much longer ground contact time. And also stride width will as well. So those stride lengths that we see, these kind of crossover gait, where we then see a larger pronation excursion angles, typically are going to see a larger ground contact time. Now don't worry too much if you're unsure what we're meaning about things like stride width and pronation excursions and even stride length. These are factors that we're going to delve much, much deeper to in the second webinar. Now, we'll do a little bit of housekeeping before we move on to our gait videos. There are a few factors that you need to bear in mind when you're doing an assessment. Don't just get someone onto the treadmill, you need to do some almost fact checking in your head. And the first one is, are you going to do the assessment on a treadmill or are you going to do it on the road? Now, there is a clear and obvious one which is better, and that's the road. And actually, vMove 2 has two different assessments. You can do the live assessment on a treadmill, or you can do the live monitoring actually when you're out on the road. And the monitoring, whenever you can, I would do it. That's always going to be the better way. You're in their natural environment, go and do it. And so you don't just have to do it on the road, you can do it on the track, you can do it around a field. That's the best way. However, with that, there are limitations. It's more difficult to physically record someone's gait when they're out and about running. And if you are able to do it, you're only going to get a smaller snapshot where you might be able to get 2 minutes of continual running on a treadmill. You might only get 10 seconds worth out on the field. So that's factors to weigh up what is suitable to do. Now we know on a treadmill there are things that are going to change it. Treadmill running is slightly different to running on the road. It is slightly easier to run at higher speeds. So we need to curb people's speeds when we're running on a treadmill. I will typically, before we get onto the treadmill and do an assessment, I will ask the individual what is their normal running speeds, and we'll set the treadmill at those speeds, and we'll typically not put them any higher than those, although they might feel like they can go them. Having them motor on the treadmill, people can run much faster. We also know with a treadmill, it is going to increase their cadence by about 4 to 5%. So again, something to bear in mind, especially if they're in their kind of cut-off periods of, say like a 170, which is just over that 165 barrier, 165 to 185 kind of range. But actually, if we take away 5% due to being running on a treadmill, they actually drop below that range. This is something, again, we need to keep in the forefront of our mind. We also know that if we overstride on a treadmill, we're definitely going to overstride on the road. But we do know as well that vertical oscillation on a treadmill is going to be less than on the road. Next factor as well we need to kind of keep for this housekeeping is speed. We just touched on it there with the treadmill. Get people running at their speeds. Obviously in the absence of when you're assessing kind of injured runners, where you might just get them on and just run at any speed, you just want to see how they're running. If we're assessing a healthy individual, we need to assess them at their speed. There is no point assessing them at a speed that they don't run at, because then we're looking at a gait that they don't run with. And we know that gait will change with different speeds as well, so it might be worthwhile assessing them over different speeds, especially at their recovery pace, at their higher interval paces, and at their kind of long continuous pace. And then when recording, I use an app called Hoodle. It's a free app, a fantastic app that can, a slow motion camera that can go down to 1/8 of the speed. An iPhone camera as well is pretty good. In fact, it's very, very good. It's got kind of a good standard on it now, particularly the newer models, the 12, the XR and things. Very, very good there. But when you are recording it as well, take note of what you're recording. Now, if you want to focus in on the ankles or the knees, get down to that level. You don't have to get right close behind them, but get down to that level, because you're going to get a much, much better representation of the individual's running start if you're closer to the joint. Time as well is a big one. So when you're running on a treadmill, give them time to familiarise to the treadmill. Treadmill running is weird. People on the first few minutes might feel like they're wobbling around a bit, almost feel like they're caged in by the treadmill. So give them time to familiarise themselves. I normally give people at least 3 minutes just running on there, just to set the speeds they're comfortable at, get used to it, relax into it before I start recording them. And equally, when I'm recording them, I don't do like a 10-second or a 20-second recording. I'll record for as much time as I possibly can. The more time you record, the more data you get in, the more like your results are going to be more indicative of what they do. A few times I've had individuals come to me and said, oh, I've had these weird results come back, and they've had ground reaction force on one side doing one thing, and on the other side it's massively different, same on ground contact time and things, but their actual assessment, they're only assessing for 20 seconds or so. Actually, if you assessed it for a little bit longer, those numbers may kind of flatten out. So assess them for as long as you physically can. And just going back to recording as well, when you do record them, just again bear in mind that with the you can't open up a second app whilst you are recording the sensors with the sensors. So you need to finish the sensor recording, press finish, let it download, get the generate report, and then you can open up kind of your Hoodle. So typically, for me, I would normally do a 3-minute familiarization period, 5 minutes of them running, and then I would press finish, close down that app, make sure it's saved before I close it down, because that's caught me out a few times, and then open up my Hoodle app and record them for probably about 30 seconds to a minute. And then penultimate point is the sensors themselves. Make sure the sensors are attached. The amount of times that this has caught me out as well, I've not properly attached them, and midway through an assessment, the sensors go AWOL, they start bobbing around or they fall off. Make sure they're attached. Recently I've been using the overwraps. I think there's great little bit additional kits. If you don't have it, I'd put it in your little bag of tools, just to wrap something around, just to secure the sensors in place. And then finally is the kit. Just as it is kind of important to assess the runner in their natural environment, it's also important to assess the runners with their natural kit. You know, if they're an ultra marathon runner and they run with a rucksack that's 5 kilos or 10 kilos or whatever it is, you need to assess them running with that, because they are going to run very, very differently with additional weight on than if they aren't. So again, something you've just got to make these assessments far more robust. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some gait videos. So with this little slide here, what we're going to do is I'm just going to play these two videos. We've got the side view and the back view. I just want you just to look at them. Don't worry about what the foot strike is, what the stride width is, stride length, vertical rotation and things like that at the moment. Just want you just to have a look at it and just think, okay, what would their ground reaction force be? What would their initial peak acceleration be? What do you think this individual is running? So some background on this individual. This is a young chap called Dan. Dan is a stunt double. He's very well built, very, very muscly, as you can see from the images here. He's got very low body fat percentage, so very, very lean, but his body mass is 112 kilos. And he's not a runner, I should also point that out. He doesn't run a lot of the time, and we can see from his shoes, they're not really running shoes as such. So he's just getting into running, I should say. So let's start with this back view. As I say, just take a note, just see what you can see from the image, and we can see we just drop down to the height of the ankles so we can see what's going on there. Okay, and we'll pause this video and we'll move on to the next video, this side view. And again, do the same thing. Just look, don't worry too much about the gait mechanics. Think about what the metrics might be. Okay, so Dan's results. Ground reaction force was high between the left and the right, 2857 and 2873. So there's a bit of a difference there. IPA, left and right, 6.3, 7.8. So that's within the normative ranges. Ground reaction force is high, above the normal range for a male of 2000, but IPA is within the normal ranges. Ground contact time is low. There is a 6 millisecond difference between the left and the right, but it's 6 milliseconds. That's not a lot, so I'm not worried about that, but it is low. Cadence is also low, 156, so bearing in mind that the treadmill will increase that by 4 or 5%, his cadence needs improving. So this was recorded at 6 miles an hour. On the treadmill, that comes out at 12.5 k. And so recorded on VMove 2, that came out as 12.5 k, which is actually a little bit higher than that. So you've also got to bear in mind that when you do an assessment on a treadmill, the speed that you set the treadmill at will actually be higher on VMove 2 because you're not decelerating. You don't get that natural deceleration on a treadmill and kind of that acceleration, you're constantly accelerating through. So the speed is going to naturally be higher. So when you're looking at doing tests and retests, make a note somewhere of what you set the speed at. So keeping these figures in mind, then we've got this high ground reaction force, we've got this IPA, which is in the normative range, ground contact time a little bit low, 10 milliseconds over what we need to be, and a low cadence. Let's look back at the videos. So do we know anything massively from this back view? Well, nothing too much that I want to draw attention to. When we go into the next webinar, we'll revisit these videos again and we will look at these in more detail. But generally, his running style isn't bad. There are definitely some points that we can improve on, but it's not bad. The fact that I want to focus more attention to is going to be the side view. So if I pause it and I can use this little bar to come across. When he's running, it looks like he's slow. He could run faster. And when I was chatting to Dan here, he was talking to me normally. He felt comfortable. He felt very comfortable. it didn't feel like that was his top speed. You know, he could hold a conversation quite nicely. We sat there for probably a minute and a half, and he wasn't struggling to breathe whilst talking. He's got a good kind of landing. He's got this kind of nice vertical tibia. A knee bend could be a little bit more. He's not using his arms at all. His mass is in, so the landing is in line with his centre of mass, a little bit further forward, but it's not too bad. But his stride length is really, really short. So that's where the cadence is going to come in. He's got this short stride length, cadence is going to be low, ground contact time is going to be high. He also, if you look at his head, there's a lot of bobbing up and down. So that vertical displacement is coming into play here. Factor into then his weight, he's 112 kilos. He's doing a lot of vertical displacement. He's got a very, very short stride length. We're then naturally going to see that high ground reaction force, that low cadence, and that high ground contact time. So we now can match up, okay, that's what the assessment came back with on the VMove 2. We look at his analysis, yeah, that fits perfectly. So we're not surprised there by the figures. So if we wanted to make a change then, what would we do? Well, first of all, you've got to ask yourself, do you need to make a change? We often rush into making a change and we don't need to do it. We don't put enough thought into it. Okay, we've got to bear in mind there is no ideal gait pattern. Gait is self-optimized, so that's two big arguments there for not changing it. Why change it when there is no ideal and gait is self-optimized? There is also lack of evidence to show the improvements in symptoms due to gait changes. However, gait is a learned skill. Running is something we learn, so we can continually add things to it. We know there are loads of runners that constantly change their running styles, so we know that it can be learnt and relearned. There is evidence to show that we can by making changes, we can reduce loading rates. Now, although there is no link to loading rates in terms of ground reaction force and injuries, we know that there are links to injuries with loading rates and things like IPA. And changes we can make can reduce pain levels. So again, that's another factor we might want to look at doing. If we can make a change that produces an individual's pain level, let's do it. Because then it might keep them running for a little while. So when you do want to make a change, keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. We are masters at overcomplicating things. Use cues the runners like. You know, if you want them to, if their knees are rubbing together, tell them to rub the knees apart. If they don't understand that, find something that they can do that they like. You know, also think about what's going to get the best bang for your buck. If you've got 5 or 6 things, don't look at changing all 5 things. Look at the thing that, what's your top priority, but also look at, well, if I change that one thing, is that going to affect the next 5? We previously talked about cadence. Dan's cadence here was low, 156 off the top of my head. I'd want to increase that. I know if I increase the cadence, IPA is going to go down, ground contact time is going to increase, ground reaction force will decrease. So that solves my problems. When we're also making a change, we've got to test and retest. Don't just test them, tell them what to do and then run away. We've got to make sure it makes that lasting change. You know? Gait changes will take 30 seconds, but to make that lasting change will take about 3 months. So we can, like with this, with Dan here, we could test him, make a little change, redo the assessment, see what that comes out with and go, right, that's what we're going to spend the next 3 months solidifying and making that a permanent change. So when we're making that change, we've got to prescribe drills with exercise. And we can't expect to change someone's biomechanics and affect all the tissues to naturally adapt to the loading rates. We've got to give them a stimulus as well. You know, and set achievable targets, you know. You're not going to make a change in a month. It's not going to happen. The evidence tells us it takes at least 3 months to make that change. So be honest with them. Tell them it's going to be the next 3 months. And for the first 4 weeks, it's going to feel really weird. Don't know if anyone has ever tried changing their own gait style, but try changing it. Go for a run and just try lifting your legs up a little bit more or swing the arms a bit more. It just feels odd. So have these honest conversations with people. So what did we do with Dan? Well, I mentioned that in Dan's run, he just looked slow. He looked like he could run faster. So that's exactly what we told him to do. We said, let's just run faster. So because Dan's new to running, he didn't really know what his speeds were. So we just increased his speed up by a couple of kilometres. Changed it from 6 on the treadmill up to 8 on the treadmill. And we'll see now what change that had. So if we look here, first we're going to look at this side view, and straight away it looks more like a running style. He's still not swinging his legs as much, he's still not swinging his arms as much, but it looks more like a running style. So if we look at this then, what things might we expect to see change-wise? Okay, I'll just play that from the middle here again. So just have a look at this and just think what you might expect to see with his new metrics. Okay, and I'll play the back view for you as well. Again, just look at it, not so much looking at the gait points, but looking at it from a point of how you think the metrics might be displayed. Okay, so these were the stats. So ground reaction force, we're not a massive change there. In fact, it's actually gone up. We're now on 2896 and 2885. IPA has also gone up, but it is within still that normal range. It's at the top end of that range now, but it is within that normal range. Ground contact time, the left-hand side hasn't really changed, but the right-hand side we have changed. And we've got that now, a little bit more of an asymmetry. We're just over that 20 millisecond bracket. Cadence has improved massively. We've gone up by about 15-20 steps to now 171 steps per minute. This is by no means perfect. This is not an ideal set of stats. There are things here I want to change. Namely, I want to reduce that ground contact time. I'm a little bit concerned of the IPA because it is right at that top end, but ground reaction force massively needs to change. So this is by no means perfect, but for me, this is more of a natural assessment, that first assessment, because now he looks like he's running normally. And this really stresses the point now of using a video with vMove 2. If we just looked at the stats from the first one, if we go back to that, we look at that and go, okay, well, let's just change cadence and that will affect things. Without looking at the video, we're not looking at going, well, he looks like he's running slow, he could run faster. Whereas now looking at these ones, although his stats aren't great, cadence really is the only thing that I'm happy with there. I'm much happier actually in the way that he's running. And if we look at this from a gait point of view, if we go back to this side view, this is where we're going to really kind of focus more of our attention on. If I slow it down just a little bit more. So we are seeing this now longer stride. And there we go, if we stop it here, we can see quite naturally a rear foot. We've got a nice bit of dorsiflexion here. And now we've got this retroverted kind of tibia. That tibia should be vertical on the landing, where it was previously in the previous video, it's not now. So that is going to increase initial peak acceleration. He is still bobbing. If we look at his head, he's going up and down, so we haven't changed that. And also, if we look at his arms, he's not really swinging his arms. And he's not really swinging his legs either. So when his legs come back here, if we follow this right leg through, has that nice kind of initial kick back into knee flexion, and it comes through, and there's no kind of hip flexion. There's no terminal swing. It just extends the knee out. So there's something there that I need to, he's got a piece of his gait missing. So that's something I want to introduce into him. So key assessment points, well, we just talked about those there. Central mass on landing is a little bit further on now. We know that's going to affect things like the ground contact time. We know that might affect ground reaction force and IPA. There is no vertical tibia. That is going to affect the IPA as well. That's going to shoot up. There's a little arm swing and there's a little leg swing. I talked about the leg swing coming into that terminal hip flexion and then terminal extension. There isn't any, or there's very, very little. So we need to introduce that in. And vertical assessment, he's still bobbing up and down. So when I look back at his stats, if we go back to this side here, the factor for me that I want to change the most is this ground reaction force. So I now look back at these. What am I going to do? What factors am I going to change? Well, I'm going to play around with the speed a little bit more, because we've messed around the speed here. We had this initial run at 6 miles an hour. We went up to 8 miles an hour with this run. And as we said, Dan is new to running. He doesn't know what his speeds are. So I'm going to play around this a little bit more, find speeds that he's comfortable with, and constantly reassess them. I might find that this 8 mile an hour now is not a speed that he likes. We might do another one. It might be 10 miles an hour or whatever, and that will then be my baseline assessment. But I'm going to play around with that a little bit more. I'm going to use simple running drills with him, because he's missing key aspects of his assessment. He's missing that terminal extension, that knee flexion. He's missing that. And if I make those changes, that might also affect his vertical displacement. It's definitely going to affect his stride length. It's going to affect his cadence a little bit. We might see that increase. Should reduce the IPA, bringing that more vertical tibia. Might change his foot strike, but that's not something I'm going to delve too much into in this video. Again, we'll talk about that in the next video. But it should definitely reduce IPA, reduce ground contact time, maybe affect cadence, and maybe affect that vertical displacement, which we know will be directly affecting his ground reaction force. I'm going to utilise things like hurdles and ladders, so just some simple drills, and again we'll talk about these drills in the later videos, just to get those mechanics around with him. Alongside this, I'm going to do a general strength program, because he's new to running, taking right back to basics, and we're just going to do some basic general strengthening, looking at the calves, looking at the hips, looking at the knees, looking at the core as well, strengthening up things so he's suitable to run. I also might do a little bit more of a hamstring bias there with him, because we know that terminal extension is not there. So it might be do some hamstring drills, particularly some eccentric drills with him. Another point I haven't put on this slide here is look at shoes. The shoes he's got, he said they're not running shoes, they're shoes he uses just to train around with. He uses them to walk around at work. So I'll actually get him into a pair of running shoes. So I'll send him over to get some running shoes, get some gait analysis in those shoes as well. And then I'm going to test and retest him. Let's say this set of stats here, not perfect at all, but for me this set of stats is better than the original set of stats, because in the second lot of stats Dan is running better. He's running in a style that suits him. And this kind of really does bring us back to why we need to do these assessments. So I just fast forward to the end here, sorry. If we just looked at the stats, we would have had no idea how Dan was actually running, what he was doing, what changes would have got. All of these things here that we picked out, these six things here, or 5 things here, we would have been completely oblivious to. We would have presumed that you might have been vertically spacing, but we would have had no evidence to support that. We're presuming, because ground reaction force is linked to that vertical displacement, but without the video we've got no supporting evidence. So that's why it's there, to give us that supporting evidence so we don't make these assumptions. There are many occasions where I initially look at someone's results and go, oh, they must be doing that, they must be doing this. When I look more at the actual running video, they go, oh, they're doing something completely new and different. And likewise, if we just look at the video, we would have no idea what Dan was actually doing in terms of metrics. We would have no idea what his ground reaction force would have been. We would have no idea what his cadence would have been, or initial peak acceleration. So when you're doing an assessment, you've got to do both of them to paint that picture. So hopefully this webinar has given you a little bit more information. You now should understand the metrics, what each of the asymmetry index, ground reaction force, initial peak acceleration, ground contact time, and cadence all mean. We should understand as well what the normative data is for these. We should also understand what factors might influence ground reaction force, ground contact time, and initial peak acceleration. We should also now understand the value of doing gait and VMove2 analysis to paint that complete picture, doing one on their own isn't going to give us all the information we need. We might make assumptions that aren't true by only doing one. And we've got a little bit of insight into gait retraining as well. And like we say, we'll be going into much more detail in the gait retraining element of in future videos. Well, I'd just like to say thank you very much for everyone for listening to today's webinar. It has gone on for a little while, so hopefully we kept you all awake. I'd just like to say thank you as well to Joe and Kerry for organising this, and hopefully we'll see a few guys coming up in the coming months for the next webinars in this series. If anyone would like to get into contact to discuss anything within this series, my details are at the bottom of this slide here. Feel free to drop me an email or give me a call if you want to discuss anything. But thank you all for listening, and we'll see you soon. Take care.